on because there we go. So for anyone who is seeing this recording, apologies, we forgot to record the first few minutes, but we can maybe make the slides available or something. So we were just talking about eclecticism and revivalism and this contrast of wanting modern housing with all of the latest technology, but wrapped in old world stylings and design. In this era, you also see the shift towards mass housing, which is related to technology and the mass production of materials. And, you know, as you have all of these revivalist options, it really becomes a kind of a style, or style becomes fashion, where people are choosing the, you know, the look of their house as a way of expressing themselves and you know, expressing their individualism. I'll also maybe mention at a few points this sort of academicism within design. So there's varying degrees to which, you know, sometimes these styles are still being designed by architects who are, you know, highly trained and schooled in, you know, ancient architecture or, you know, the architecture of Europe. But there's also then that, again, that as with fashion, that distilling of that down into these more pedestrian or more middle class houses, which are what we'll see a lot of today. So the first style that we're going to touch on is the colonial revival, speaking of revivalism, which is, you know, generally a simple rectangular massing. This example is a pretty grand one, but it's the governor's mansion, really in the Georgian style specifically, which is like a subset of colonial revival. You have this sort of low sloped hipped roof with these ornamented dormers. It's very symmetrical and centrally planned with the central door right in the middle of the building. Excuse me, the windows are placed very regularly. There's very little, variation, maybe a little bit on the sides or the rear. And most commonly, you'll see these are built, they'll either be wood construction, not so much in Denver, or they'll be brick with wood detailing, which is what you'll see here. So, you know, it's a brick box, but you have these, you know, wood pilasters at the corners that are adding a little more detail, a little more classical detailing to it. A major component of this sort of design, as well as this emphasis on the entrance, and that being a place where you really concentrate the ornament, like you have this sort of this broken swan's neck pediment at the second story, where you have sort of these really eccentric curves above the front porch. So colonial revival also appears in institutional buildings, not so much in commercial. I mean, though they do exist. But probably the most common place you see colonial revival would be in churches. You will also sometimes see them in academic or financial institutions. But here's an example of the First Baptist Church here in Denver. You know, so obviously with a church, this spire is really iconic, but you have this really tall pointed spire that then sits on this kind of varied octagonal and then square base on top of an even more square tower that still has these kind of classical details associated with it, like the sort of rounded pediments above the louvered openings in the steeple. Lower down on the church, you have this, you know, really grand columned entrance with the very classical pediment on it. So this is just a really great example of a sort of a colonial revival. It does toe the line of being a little more neoclassical, which we'll touch on in a bit. But the spire of this really, in my mind, sets it as an example of a colonially inspired church here in Denver. And this style is also, I think, much more common back east, where you have more actual colonial buildings also around. Looking at that sort of like here versus there, some differences on the right, we have two examples here in Denver. The top one being a much more modest. I mentioned that the governor's residence is a pretty grand, you know, very ornate Georgian example. The one on the top right there is a little more pared down. You know, there's still that emphasis on the front door with its pediment and kind of columns. Below that is another variation. So there is a lot of variety within colonial design. And this one is more of the sort of Dutch colonial style, which you can tell by the gambrel roof, that sort of barn style roof. But it still has some of the same features of its, you know, it's symmetrical, it's centrally planned, classical details at the porch and things like that. And then again, just on the left are some other examples from other parts of the country. The one in the kind of center bottom is a fairly ornate, fairly grand kind of Georgian. To the left of that is an example of a wood frame one, which is, again, something that's not very common. Wood frame structures are quite uncommon in Denver, but you'd see that a lot more back east in actual colonial as well as in colonial revival design. And then above that is just another kind of more modest colonial revival house. Again, the emphasis on that entrance and on otherwise quite sparse. And I just want to take this moment to throw back to one of those themes that we introduced in the first webinar, which was about those historical precedents and the adaptation. In that one, we were talking about actual neoclassical architecture, which then transformed into Romanesque, which then over time transformed into Gothic. And you'll see that now where, this is carried forward where, Romanesque continues to inspire other eras of architecture, and the same thing with Gothic. And actual, Roman or Greek classical architecture. And these precedents inspire, but are, in an ongoing way adapted. And so that's where, the colonial architecture itself is often inspired by classical or Renaissance architecture, which we'll talk more about. And then is morphed and adapted to different building forms and uses and eras and methods of construction. So talking about quite a different historical precedent that doesn't have as much of a classical origin, but is the Tudor revival, getting its name from the Tudor family, who were the monarchs of England in the 16th century, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, about partly, yes. Anyway, this is a very common residential style here in Denver. You'll see that the grander Tudor revival residences, like this one shown here, often have these really irregular and kind of rambling masses with projecting bays, and it moves around. It has different roof forms. It's got gables and hips and hip dormers and shed dormers and all sorts of things. The windows are quite irregular. And then you also see this mixing of materials of brick or masonry, sometimes patterned or carved with extra ornament, as well as probably the calling card, so to speak, of Tudor revival being that half timbering that you see at the second floor. Oops, sorry, skipping ahead here. Some other features are the oriel window above the front door there, a very common feature with its decorative diamond patterned muntins. You also see groupings of casements, prominent chimneys, and the sort of some of these projections and shifts in the massing at the second floor are also very common, like that far left kind of wall dormer above another bay window, that just kind of complexity of massing. Again, this is a pretty grand example of the Tudor revival, and like the more modest kind of cousin of the Tudor revival is what's called here the English Norman cottage, which you can see all over Denver, which has a lot of the same features, but has more of an emphasis on masonry construction. As you can see here, this one doesn't have any half timbering, though you will sometimes see some with that. One of the key features of this one is that chimney is made extremely prominent, often at the front of the house. You have that compound chimney with the sort of, shifted shapes of the flues towards the top, and extremely, steeply pitched roof. And again, the irregular windows and a little bit of decorative patterning in the masonry. So related to the Tudor, but much more, modest in its scale. Typically, these will only be one story, even though it has this big roof that may or may not actually be occupiable. And then again, related to this is the collegiate Gothic, which really historically developed in tandem with the Tudor style in England. And this is, again, a variation on that Gothic. There's much more of a sort of horizontal emphasis in this sort of design, because you're seeing these often applied to academic buildings, thus the kind of collegiate. This is William Byers Junior High School here in Denver, so not actually college, but you'll see these, of course, on all sorts of college campuses around the country. You have those really classic Gothic details, like the tracery windows and the kind of crenellations along the parapet. Sometimes this one has more of segmental arches, which is kind of also a variation from that more pure Gothic style, but you'll often see pointed or segmental arches included in this style. So the segmental arch being that sort of shallow curve above the front door. Again, really regular windows are quite common to this. And again, it's sort of an adaptation of another style of that Gothic style. Here for some variety are some examples of Tudor and that English Norman cottage style. At the bottom right, you can see a much more colorful example of the English Norman cottage here in Denver with, kind of different take on that ornamented and compound chimney there, but still featured really prominently. Above that is a private residence in the country club neighborhood, which is an example of like the most grand Tudor revival houses, which you can see even actually have some of there's more of an emphasis on maybe stone or masonry. And we'll actually share some features with that collegiate Gothic style, like the kind of tracery windows that are grouped on the bays, and again, also having those really prominent chimneys. And then on the left are some other examples of this kind of Tudor revival style that you might see around the country. On the far left there at the top is one that has much more of an emphasis on that half timbering, which again, you don't see as much here. The one on the bottom left is kind of a much more colorful and a little more fantastical, I would say, with the patterning in the masonry and the different colors and the more complex half timbering. So this is quite a varied style and will vary a lot across different sizes of houses that people are building. Moving on, a fairly uncommon style here in Denver, but there are some good examples of it, is what's called the French eclectic, which is in some ways the French version of that Tudor revival. It's kind of a more casual, like country style that you would see around, around France. This is often characterized by like a really low horizontal massing. I think another big feature is this really, these buildings often have these really prominent, massive roofs. They're just like, there's so much roof on this building for some reason. Often steeply pitched with maybe, tile or, wood shingles. This example has a little bit of that classical detailings and folded into it, incorporated in, such as at the doorway, where they're sort of highlighting that. Even the arched pediments above those dormers kind of also are a classical reference. And then it's a pretty pretty plain wall, but it does have a little bit of detail with the coining at the corners that add a little bit of texture and kind of frame the whole building. So again, an interesting style, but one that you don't see too much of here in Denver. Next, we're going to look at the Mission Revival, and this and the next two styles I think are all very closely related, kind of like Tudor and Gothic were before, but there's some important distinctions. So the Mission Revival is really based off of the Spanish missions that you see around the southwestern United States and in Mexico, which are themselves inspired by the Baroque churches of Europe. And so probably the key feature, the dead giveaway for a Mission Revival, is going to be this really complicated and curvaceous parapeted gable that you see above this kind of triple arch, and then also the smaller versions of that to the side. That's one of the big things. So the Mission Revival is often a little bit more, exuberant with those shapes that set it apart from the next style we're going to look at. Ooh, didn't want to go there yet. But commonly you also see terracotta tile roofing on this style with deep eaves. This one has exposed rafters underneath those. And then this one also has a lot of classical influence in that front porch with the Corinthian columns. You don't always see that, but that's just kind of an interesting aspect of this. I noted stucco exterior. I think that's quite commonly what you'll see, but you will also see brick or stone exteriors for Mission Revival. Our next example is the Spanish Colonial Revival, which, even in the name is kind of, well, the missions are also Spanish colonial, but this is often a much more simple style. You see here it has much smaller eaves. It still has that terracotta tile roof and the stucco exterior, but there's a lot less kind of ornament going on, kind of akin to the colonial revival we were talking about before. You'll see that the extent of the ornament is often limited to the sort of some stuff around the door. So this one has a little bit of a kind of shaped archway above the front door and a little bit of trim around the windows, but otherwise it's quite kind of spare in its detailing at the exterior. Another fairly, those other two styles you see a fair amount around Denver. This one's not so common, the Pueblo Revival, which is actually more inspired by Native American Pueblo construction, but you'll see that it does often incorporate elements of the Spanish colonial or maybe even the mission revival styles. So in this case, there's this incorporation of terracotta tile accents around the structure, this little kind of pent roof and above the windows and things like that. So that's a bit of a reference to the Spanish colonial, but this sort of flat roofed, very kind of plain wall surfaces, detailing on a massing that is kind of a couple of boxes, a couple of different forms smushed together, so to speak, is what makes this really a Pueblo, more of a Pueblo revival. In particular as well, this one has the vigas, which are those kind of exposed log ends, which are meant to emulate the rafters that in actual Pueblo construction, just stick out through the wall. Those are also a very common feature of Pueblo revival, though there are some instances where you may not see those, which I'll show you now. So again, on the right are some other examples. So at the bottom right is a kind of a Spanish colonial house, but one that's actually a little more exuberant than the one I showed before. Here you can really see that highly decorated entrance, which even then has a decorated window with a cartouche above that. And so kind of just showing a little bit of that variety. And then above that is a kind of interesting example again of that mixing of styles of the Pueblo revival and also the Spanish colonial revival. It's a building called Carmen Court here in Denver, which this is, I think, a really good example of that massing of that, the sort of different height boxes that are kind of combined and squished together, which are really what you see with actual Pueblos, historic Pueblos in the southwestern United States. But this one, it doesn't have the vigas, but instead it has a little bit more of that detail pulling from the Spanish colonial with some terracotta above the doors and windows and such. And then on the left are again some, on the top left, you have a good example of the Pueblo revival, a little more pure maybe with the vigas exposed. And then below that, some versions of the Spanish colonial revival, pretty modest bungalow on the left, and then in the middle there, a little more grand, but still pretty plain, that emphasis on the door, a little bit of ironwork, but still mostly kind of flat, smooth walls. So, that was covering some of the more common, revivalist styles and more eclectic ones. And then in contrast to that is this what's called the City Beautiful movement, which is where there's more of this return to really classically inspired design. So this was a city planning movement that was inspired by the White City, which was the name of the fairgrounds for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. It was this, a fantastic world exposition where there was this campus, of acres and acres of these, beautiful white, classically inspired buildings. That left image is an image of the sort of grand court of that with this, what was a gilded statue. And then on the right of that is kind of the outgrowth of that movement as exemplified in Denver. So that's the Voorhees Memorial located in Civic Center Park, and you can see kind of the grand scale of the architecture. So the goal of this movement was really to think about creating efficient, beautiful, and planned cities. It's kind of a response to the grime and the chaos of the Industrial Revolution and how that had shaped cities in the 19th and into the 20th century. And there was this sense of like we needed to, the cities needed to be cleaned up and reorganized. So this City Beautiful movement was really a vehicle for progressive reforms as well. And again, had this emphasis on really grand, classically inspired designs. And also had this wonderful component of connections between buildings and open spaces and parks. A Civic Center here in Denver, as pictured on the right there, is a good example of that, where you'd sit in this beautiful classical portico and look out over a fountain and over Civic Center Park. So we're going to cover a couple of styles that are really tied to this movement. So the first one being classical revival, which, we've talked about how there's classical influences in a bunch of the styles we've looked at, but this is I usually think of it as the purest version of that, the most maybe academic, where they're kind of adhering most closely to actual Roman or Greek design, but there's still some adaptation. But the detailing is often like very carefully structured to match, those Roman or Greek forms. So, here you have a bit of this temple front on the curve, but with these very classically proportioned Ionic columns and the really prominent classical cornice above it. There's a little bit of detailing at the wall surfaces with, the coins and things like that. These also, though, like kind of pulling from the idea of the Roman temples, are often, very simple massing and very symmetrical in plan, and very, centrally planned. So here it's perfectly symmetrical on this front facade, and the windows are very consistent. As well, related to that idea of the white city, of the clean, bright, utopian vision of the city, these buildings were often built out of stone, limestone or marble maybe, or, as is the case here, I think, other than some of the details, a buff brick, so a light colored brick, as opposed to that more common red brick that we've seen in a lot of other examples. Classical revivals also seen in some commercial buildings, primarily banks, I think, were probably the most used this style the most. And this is an example of the Colorado National Bank building. I picked a historic image because this building has actually had some interesting but not classical alterations made to it. So there's the address. You can go look up what it looks like now. But here you can see it's very pure in its, these monumental colonnades. The columns, are 3 stories tall, and masking, the floors of the building within. You have this, really prominent classical cornice. On this one, you also had some classical motifs, a little more ornamented, as you can see above the corner there, kind of above the colonnade, above the cornice. There's some panels that have a little bit more, floral and interesting decoration. Excuse me. This style also often has, a monumental doorway that really has the emphasis on it. And even if you go back to this example of the residential version of the classical revival, you can see that in the, that you have this double height portico marking, this is where the entrance is. So there's your commercial example. And then looking at an institutional example, which will often be akin to the commercial, but at, I think, generally a much grander scale. Again, perfectly symmetrical, centrally planned, often a rectangular massing, here with the city and county building. That central portion is rectangular, and then the overall thing is, but then there's kind of this interesting curved, element incorporated, which is maybe departing a little bit from true classical, Roman design, but still adheres to that grandeur and that sort of, purity of the form. Super consistent window patterns. You have this really, really pure temple front in the middle there, that, looks just like the Maison Carrée that I was showing earlier when we were talking about historic precedents and adaptation. But it's kind of modernized, because above that, as well as that spire, which is something that would not be on a true Roman temple, but is itself actually derived from a Roman form. That colonnaded round portion of the tower is inspired from the Temple of Vesta, which you find in the Roman Forum. So that's also where, when you get to these institutional or some of these commercial buildings, they're much more academic, where, if you've been trained in recognizing these forms, you can point to them and say, oh, I know where that came from, or the architect is, pulling from all these different sources in a way that's kind of trying to, show off their own knowledge and all of that. So that's that kind of academic version of this style. Related to that is the Renaissance revival, which, there's a great irony to that. The Renaissance was itself a revival of the classical tradition, but then we revived it again in the early 20th century. I think one of the big differences is, again, you have those classical details, but there's much more a sense of they're kind of applied to the surface of the building. The classical buildings, like if we look back at the city and county building, you have these like big round columns that are sticking out or are fully, standing away from the building. Whereas here on this Renaissance revival building, you have these kind of delicate little pilasters at the corners that are just kind of stuck onto the surface of the building. So in a residential context, which isn't super common, I think in Denver, you'll often see a terracotta tile roof, a low sloped hipped roof, but still that prominent cornice, the kind of column details, and then also these arched windows with columns and again some more classically inspired decoration. Looking at a commercial example, and probably the best example of it here in Denver is the Equitable building in downtown, which has that same kind of theme of the detail is really just kind of like applied onto the surface of the building. You have a couple of full columns around this Palladian window at the center of the facade, but they're actually still kind of inset into the wall of the building. And the only things that are projecting are these kind of decorative balconies and then this really, really heavy prominent cornice. So it's a really fabulous example of a Renaissance revival. And it's interesting when you think about that this is kind of pulling inspiration from, these big palazzos that you might see in Renaissance, that were built in the Renaissance in Italy, but, at a monumental scale, way oversized. Those buildings would have been maybe 4 stories maximum. And, here you have, like 8 or 9 stories. So kind of taking that form and stretching it out and expanding the ornament and all of that. And I also wanted to point out another really fabulous Renaissance revival example here in Denver is the Denver Mint. Again, it's a very flat kind of surface, except for this really prominent cornice, and it's just these little bit of details around the windows and the kind of texturing in the rustication of the facade. It's a really fabulous building, and I also think it's quite kind of cheeky, I guess I'd say, because this building is really directly inspired by the Palazzo Medici in Florence, which the Medicis were a famous banking family. So there's, something kind of clever, again, thinking about that academic take on things of saying, oh, it's a mint. Well, I'll pull from that sort of historical, banking history in the form of it and kind of trying to signal something through that. And then a related style to those two is what's called the Beaux-Arts, which is in some ways really kind of a mixing of them. It often has a lot more of the kind of excitement in its mass and the sort of shifts in wall plane that you see in some of the classical revival buildings, but has much more kind of exuberant and freeform ornament that you might see on some of those Renaissance revival buildings. So, if you're looking at the piers that kind of frame those 3 arched windows, they have all of these kind of stone garlands and cartouches and all these decorative features that you wouldn't see on a classical building, but you'd see maybe on a Renaissance revival. But really fabulous example of a Beaux-Arts building. They're often a lot more complex in the massing. There are more shifts and things like that. But yeah, just a really great example of that style. And then here's kind of a mashup of all 3 of those styles. Maybe not so much the Renaissance revival shown here, but in the top left is a really great example of a Beaux-Arts building where it's a lot more exuberant than the sort of central top center image, which is the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is that like really pure classicism, right? It looks just like a Roman temple. When you compare that to the Beaux-Arts building to the left of it, you can see where that Beaux-Arts styling had a little more freedom. The 2 examples on the right are here in Denver, the Church of Christ Scientist at the top right, which is a little more pure classical, but still has some, variation to it. And then below that is the Grant Humphreys Mansion, which is, really fabulous example that, I actually think kind of toes the line between neoclassical and Renaissance revival. It has those really prominent columns, but there's also a lot of ways that it has a little more detail than you might normally see on a classical revival. And then to the left are some other, bottom left are some other houses from around the country in the classical revival style. And again, I think you can see some of that mixing of the styles, and they're not quite as pure as, say the Philadelphia Museum there in the top center, but still are, so clearly inspired by Roman architecture. Interestingly as well, I think those 2 are both wood framed, which again is something that you wouldn't really see here in Denver. So one of the themes we're going to introduce here as well, which relates to this kind of progressive movement, that some of the background context to this era of architecture we're talking about is, thinking about the floor plan, the programming, and the use of buildings, and the kind of progressiveness of that. You shift from where in those grand Victorian houses you'd have said, okay, well, these are the formal spaces, which are, beautifully laid out and all of that. And then there's, a room at the back that's the kitchen, and that's where, the servants are, preparing the food or whatever, or if it's a lower class house, maybe they just don't have the luxury of, really designing their spaces. In this era with more of these eclectic and kind of middle class houses, there's this emphasis placed on functionality and ease of use, because now, the families that live in the houses are the ones that are running the households. So this is also related to that kind of home economic movement. And so you see, advertisements like these here where, the left image is more of a sort of a guide of, thinking about how you should lay out your kitchen so that you can work efficiently. And then on the right, is an advertisement for, buying this, kitchen setup will improve your life by making things easier. So again, there's that emphasis on functionality and ease of use. And, there you can see in the image, the way it's structured, right, that, the mother is doing the ironing while also watching her child, as opposed to in the Victorian era, it might be a nanny preparing, doing the ironing or something like that. So just kind of that shift that in the design of these houses that's related to the rise of the middle class and who's using these buildings and who they're being designed for. So thinking about floor plan and use, I'm going to touch on two types actually we were talking about one of those main concepts being style versus type. Thus far, we've mostly been talking about style, but here we're going to touch on type. This is one that's very common in Denver. I actually don't know if I think of this as something I've seen in a lot of other places, or at least back east where I'm from, but it's the terrace type, it's called, which is a very kind of modest working class house design that you saw here in the very late 19th century and into the early 20th century. Typically, they're just single story, and there's sort of like a single story row house where you have these separate porches, separate entrances, often with, kind of a little bit of classical detailing at the columns. But, these two units would be structured exactly the same, where you'd walk in, you'd be in the living space, which might just be, sort of living dining, and then there'd be a small kitchen behind it. And then to the side would be, maybe one or two bedrooms. And that, that plan holds true across this type. So, these two units will be the same, but if you found a different terrace type, it would probably be pretty similar. These are typically with a flat roof that may or may not have a kind of ornamented parapet like you see here. This one actually, it's almost a little bit of like a Mission Revival inspiration with the, the kind of shape of the pediment, or excuse me, of the parapet. The next type we're going to look at is the classic cottage type, which is very common here in Denver. It's a super simple rectangular plan. Sometimes there'll be a small bay window at the side. Always 1.5 stories with a shallow hipped roof, often with a flared eave. You can see here how the eaves kind of shallow out at the edges, and then always with this, classical front porch. That's why the form is really the cottage, and then it's called the classic cottage because there's just so many of them that have this, classical columns at the porch. Sometimes it'll just be a partial, or more commonly, I think, a full width porch. And so with both of these, you actually are seeing some of that where these are more middle class houses, but there is that, the design of them is the floor plan is very kind of casual. And actually the classic cottage has a similar layout generally to the terrace type, though probably a little bit more spacious. But you walk into, your living dining room. Beyond that is a kitchen, and it's much more of a kind of like free flowing layout because it's less formal. It's for more of a middle class family where they're caring for their house. So related to this as well is something we touched on a little bit last time of the mass production of materials, and how before we were talking about kind of catalogs of materials that might be purchased and then applied to different houses. You'd pick out the brackets that you want to tack onto a style. But you see this also growing to the point of having, where you could buy a whole house. So the most famously, the Sears and Roebuck, kit homes, which come, everything you need, cut to size, packed into, a train car and dropped off in your town, and then you can assemble your house. So it's sort of, the ramping up of that mass production of materials from the scale of just the parts that are chosen and then applied to a house to sometimes the whole design and the whole floor plan of the house. So on the right is an example of a Sears and Roebuck Craftsman, which we'll talk about shortly. But you also see there on the left a little bit more of a Spanish colonial inspired kind of kit home or basic plan. So the Foursquare type is another type that is kind of the next step above as far as the scale from that classic cottage, where these are more always 2.5 stories. So you have the same plan always. If you walk into kind of like a stair hall, to your right, or maybe it's to your left, you have the the living room, the dining room behind it, and then the kitchen in the back. And then up at the top of the stairs will be 3 or 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. And it's this very casual kind of layout with these spaces that are all interconnected, but have all of those modern amenities. Like you'd have a more modern kitchen, you'd have a fully plumbed bathroom and things like that. And this is a really great example, I think, of where you can see that this is this type of this very square massing with symmetrical windows at the front, because you have the 2 bedrooms at the top, but with a little bit of variety. They all have the dormer and the hipped roof with the kind of deep eaves, but there's a little bit of variety. The one on the right has a little more decoration in the windows. The next one to the left just has those paired windows and so on and so forth. So the same type, but they're kind of dressed up differently in different styles. Again, think about those mass-produced materials where the builder may have purchased all of their windows and the brackets on the house from a catalog and then just applied those on. So again, there we were mostly looking at revivalism, and now we're going to kind of look at the other way in which this whole kind of progressive movement of design, the shift away from, the clutter of the Victorian era and the dirtiness of the Industrial Revolution and all that, is now being looked at through, this question of, should there be new styles? Like, why do we always adhere to, revivalism? So there was that questioning of those traditional architectural styles. This is also related to, a search in the United States for a national identity. There was a lot of discussion among architects and designers in this era where they're like, what is American style? Some said it should be neoclassical, and others said it should be something totally new. Again, prompted by these progressive forms. And you'll also see in some of these instances where there's an exploration of the new construction technologies. So the image shown here is the Guarantee Building, designed by Louis Sullivan, who was one of the proponents of the need for a new architectural style for the U.S. And this is, an early skyscraper with a steel frame construction, clad in terracotta, modern materials, implied in this totally new kind of design. There's a lot of floral ornament and things like that, which you might see in older styles. But I think, Louis Sullivan's aesthetic was really, really unique and different and broke entirely from those traditional architectural styles. So there is a style named Sullivan-esque that's kind of inspired by him. Not really something you find here, but his work did inspire or is related to some other designers and then styles that we're going to talk about. So just quickly to kind of hit on 2 big names in this era as far as new styles and new designs in the United States are Frank Lloyd Wright, who is really the progenitor of the prairie style, which we'll talk about in a moment. There you see one of his exteriors in Oak Park, Illinois, where he started his career. And then below that is the interior of another house that he designed. Excuse me, but you can see how these really don't have any of that sense of revivalism, and they're much more sparse than Sullivan. Sullivan had this really exuberant ornament. Frank Lloyd Wright was much more kind of pared down. And then the other designer I want to mention is Gustav Stickley, who's probably the biggest name in the craftsman movement in the United States. And craftsmen and the arts and crafts movement both are kind of interesting, where they're progressive, but also in a way that's kind of trying to reject, in some ways, that modernity. There was this concern about the rise of machines and mass production and all of that, and so there was this desire to return to craftsmanship and to human scale of design and the work of humans in our architecture and in our furniture. And so it's related to those same kind of progressive ideals of wanting to, clean up the mess of the Industrial Revolution and improve people's lives, but it kind of goes in the opposite direction of, instead of saying like, oh, well, what are all the things that we can do with all those new technologies? It's a bit of a, well, maybe we should reject some of those. So that top image is the Craftsman Farms, which was his kind of his estate in New Jersey. And then below that, an iconic Gustav Stickley chair, with some of the exposed joinery. I don't know if you can quite see that, but his style of furniture had this emphasis on being able to see the way it was built by, a craftsperson. And then an image of, one of his ideal interiors. So to kind of pick apart their styles a little more, we have the prairie style here, which is really about this sort of horizontal emphasis. This is actually one here in Denver. It often has these deep eaves. There's sometimes some breaking up of the massing with these projections and things like that. You also have, groupings of windows, which is kind of different than a lot of the revival styles we were seeing, where you have more distinct windows. But you'll also notice that other than those groups of windows, the windows are much more irregular, and that's, related to that idiom of form follows function, that these buildings should be designed with a sensible layout, and then you'd place the windows related to that, as opposed to, placing the windows evenly and then making it work at the interior. So that's the prairie style. And then, of course, the craftsman style, something that's very, very common here in Denver. Often a sort of boxy massing. Sometimes you'll have like a small projection at the side, 1.5 stories, shallow gabled roofs, or in this case, we have the jerkin head roof, which is where the kind of point of the gable is clipped off. And again, you have that same idea of where the windows are actually arranged around the interior program, as opposed to, looking for a very even exterior appearance. We also have here the polychromatic masonry. I think this is kind of that distinct flavor of the craftsmen in Denver, that they're almost exclusively brick, at least at the first story. And then to add some interest to them, they would use maybe 2, sometimes 3 colors of brick to add some detailing to it and actually show off the, the craftsmanship of the masons who are laying those bricks. It's kind of an interesting contrast to these examples I have on the left from other parts of the country are wood frame, which is quite common, I think you see. And in those instances, you have wood frame construction, but then there's maybe some more interest in the limited use of stone. So that bottom middle one, you can see those piers are actually river rock, for an interesting kind of texture and adding some craftsmanship as far as how those are built. On the top left is, I believe it's the Gamble House, which is not precisely a craftsman building. It's actually more considered arts and crafts, which is related to the craftsman movement. But I just kind of wanted to bring it up. It has a lot of the same principles of this emphasis on, a kind of returning to things being handcrafted and emphasis on the work of the craftsman. But this is really a West Coast style that has actually a lot of influence from China and Japan. In the early 20th century, a lot of designers were traveling to those parts of the world and were becoming inspired by their aesthetics and their design. And so it's related to craftsmen, but a slightly different flavor, and maybe sadly something that we don't really see much of here in Denver. On the right are two really classic examples of craftsman bungalows here in Denver. Though with slightly different forms, right? A front gable versus the side gable, a partial width porch versus the full width, and so on. I also wanted to, one of the themes we were going to touch on in this series was thinking about building change and how buildings change over time. Apologize, these aren't the best images, but these 5 houses are actually all right next to each other in kind of the Cole neighborhood, I think it is. And I think you can probably see that they would have actually when they were built as little Queen Anne cottages, they were identical. So the 2 at the top are probably the most intact, so to speak. But there are some slight differences, still in, one of them has had some bars installed over the windows. The porch has also been kind of redone with masonry walls. But then below that, you can see 3 more houses that have changed a lot more. The one on the left at the bottom has kind of gotten the full vinyl treatment, and the porch has been replaced in a little bit more of a craftsman style. The one in the middle has been a little bit simplified. And then on the one on the right is, I think, really interesting because it's a Queen Anne house, but someone probably in the 1920s, redid the porch. They tore off that partial width porch and they decided to slap on a really craftsman style porch. So that's one of the kind of tricks that you might get caught up on when you're looking at some of these buildings is you might see features of one style, but that doesn't mean actually that the whole building is from that era. People would sometimes update a building to reflect changing tastes and changing sensibilities. So kind of an interesting, image of that evolution all in a row. So now we're on to our last two, which are some more types. And we were just talking about craftsmen's, and typically we talk about craftsman bungalows. Craftsman is the style and bungalow is the type. Those two have basically become synonymous and are just most of the craftsmen we have are bungalows, but you will also see bungalows in other styles. The bungalow really being that kind of boxy, simple massing, typically one, maybe 1.5 stories, could be flat or hipped or gabled roofs. The windows, again, arranged around the interior program, and then often with a front porch or maybe a little terrace. So this is an example of a bungalow that's a little bit more in that Spanish colonial style, which is kind of given away by the terracotta tile roof, and kind of the open terrace at the front. But so it's to say that the bungalow is a type as distinct from the style, though most bungalows you'll see in Denver are going to be in the craftsman style. And then another kind of relative of this is what's called the bungalow court, which is where you basically have, maybe 5 or 6 bungalows combined together around a little central courtyard. This one is interesting because it's actually more in the Tudor Revival style. So they are, very simple 1.5 story buildings, but you have a little bit more complexity in the roof line, which is, related to the Tudor Revival style. But it has that same very modest kind of form arranged around the central court. We don't have a ton of examples of the bungalow court in Denver from this era, but you'll see they'll become much more common in our next webinar. And that is where I will finally end it. So next Thursday, Abby will be giving part 3 of our architectural styles webinar series in celebration of Preservation Month. And then we also have coming up in June and July some webinars related to researching historic buildings and then also writing historic designations. So I'm happy to take any questions if there are any, but I also know I went maybe a little bit long. So are there any questions, Abby?
I do not see any.
All right. Well, we'll end it there then. Thank you everyone who attended. I hope you enjoyed it and found it informative.
Thanks everyone.